Prior to supervising the juvenile team, I tried felony cases, including cases where my clients were accused of committing gang-related crimes. I recall a case where my 18-year-old Latino client, let's call him Hugo, was facing nearly a decade in prison for allegedly throwing rocks at some men in a red car. Charged with assault with a deadly weapon, rocks being the weapon, and vandalism in the alternative, I knew we would have an uphill battle once I received the predicate offenses from the district attorney. My client was a young Puerto Rican kid who hung out with his hot-headed younger brother and had an outstanding GPA. He had excellent attendance at school, he had no tattoos, and participated in youth programs at a local teen center in his neighborhood. Suddenly, his life was turned upside down and he was facing years in prison. The case was not complicated factually. Hugo, his brother, and friends were accused of throwing rocks at a red car driving by as they were walking down the street. The guys in the red car made a U-turn, got out of the car, and allegedly confronted the group of kids. One claimed that Hugo threw a rock at them. Of course, Hugo's version was much different. A group of men in a red car chased them down, got out of the car with a wrench, and the group of kids were forced to defend themselves. The trial could have ended in just a day. Who did what? Who threw rocks? Did the rocks hit any person or vehicle? Was anyone injured? Were there monetary damages? Instead, the trial lasted over a week with testimony from a gang expert, namely a police officer. It involved a review of numerous FI cards, field identification cards, many of which involved the police documenting whom my client was associating with. It was only on cross-examination that the jury learned nearly every time he was walking with his younger brother. When I introduced a counselor from the local teen center to testify that Hugo routinely attended the teen center in the area to rebut that it was in fact gang territory, the DA attempted to argue that gang members recruited teens from that teen center. Thankfully, the judge was not having any of it and shut down that argument, pointing out that many parents in poverty-stricken or so-called high-crime areas fight for teen centers precisely to protect their children from such negative influences. However, another judge could have ruled much differently. Finally, the DA presented numerous prejudicial photos of leaders of the gang, OGs, complete with far more serious crimes and tatted from head to toe. Meanwhile, none of the predicates involved Hugo. He had no prior criminal or juvenile history. There were no pictures of him holding weapons or flashing gang signs. Ultimately, the jury was unable to reach a verdict and they hung. And the case resolved short of a retrial for no jail time. Hugo's mom was so shaken by the experience, she and Hugo agreed it'd be best if he moved to Puerto Rico to live with her family and attend college. Looking back, I am confident Hugo would have been acquitted had the underlying charge been tried separately from the gang enhancement. There was reasonable doubt as to whether he threw a rock at all, or if he threw it, if it was in fact in self-defense. The gang enhancement dragged us into what felt like a trial within a trial. Instead of spending time and resources on the crime itself, the case turned into whether Hugo was in fact a gang member, or at minimum, associating with all these older OGs. And was that association in play on this fateful day? You may be thinking, wow, this sounds like a fairly weak case. Or why wasn't this charged as a misdemeanor? I don't know. My client would have likely settled for a misdemeanor with no gang enhancement just to avoid any risk of incarceration, but that was not offered. It was a strike. And what I do know from my 16 years of experience is that the gang enhancement lessens the DA's burden of proof. It just does. The jury cannot help but be terrified when they see images of tatted up people who have either been accused or convicted of very serious crimes. It doesn't matter what the person facing trial looks like or what they're about. They become guilty by association. In my case, we spent a tremendous amount of time hearing evidence about gangs, and thus I was forced to spend an incredible amount of time pointing out how it didn't make sense. He had a high GPA. He was a good kid. No violence in his past, no criminal history, and so on. For Hugo to face a gang enhancement himself was just unreal. I also realized that the more we talked about the gang, the less time we were talking about Hugo and what actually happened that day. And although it was the DA's burden, my client and I felt that we were the ones carrying the very heavy burden of proving lack of association, as opposed to simply arguing that the state had not met its burden as to the underlying offense.